Hi, everyone. This is Talkback. I'm doing a special series of programs on Channel 14, the Comcast channel out of Norwich and surrounding areas. And in this time of the virus and the stay-at-home orders, we're helping with technology to bring a lot of information to you. I have a special program today. I'm going to speak with Rabbi Aaron Rosenberg from Waterford, who for many years was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. He's now the emeritus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Am I, Rabbi?
You are. You are.
Okay, great. Rabbi Emeritus. And now he's done a lot of research and has an interest in the history of the Jews of southeastern Connecticut. And he's done a PowerPoint, and he was about to make a talk when, unfortunately, we got hit with the coronavirus crisis. So now we're using all of our social media and other methods to get information. So good afternoon, Rabbi. Good to have you.
Good to be here.
Okay. So tell me, you have an interest in southeastern Connecticut because how many years have you lived here since you came to be the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel?
40 years.
Wow. You came here 40 years ago. But you yourself grew up in a different Jewish community somewhere else. Where was that?
I'm a Chicagoan at heart, and I know they say you can take someone out of Chicago, but you can't take Chicago out of them. So I'm still a Bears fan, a Cubs fan, but I've been here for 40 years in Connecticut. I have no regrets. I love Connecticut, especially southeastern Connecticut.
All right. So did you grow up in the city of Chicago or in a suburban area in Illinois?
The answer is yes. I was born at Michael Reese Hospital, and my first couple of years I lived in what was the Jewish ghetto, the Old West Side. Then we moved up to Albany Park, which is the north side of Chicago. To give you an example how Jewish that neighborhood was, my second grade class had 48 students, 46 and a half of them were Jewish, and that was a public school. By the way, that school is Judenrein today. All the Jews fled to the suburbs. I grew up from age 11, or actually age 12 on, I lived in Wilmette, Illinois, one of the suburbs. And we thought, oh, it's such a non-Jewish area. There's only 25% Jews here. But yeah, and I went to high school in Winnetka, Illinois.
Oh, that's interesting. So my experience was similar, that I grew up in New York and in the inner city, in the Bronx, and of course in the 40s and the 50s, that was the age, in the 60s, where those people from the inner cities, the Jewish community, moved to the suburbs, very similar to the other urban areas. But now in southeastern, different kind of environments. How is it different, both, of course, geographically and just environmentally and every other way when you moved here? And you obviously were not in a majority situation. There's a smaller population of Jews in this more rural Eastern Connecticut area. How did that feel
There's
to
my
you?
wife. She's in the background. Hi.
I can get it on the computer now.
No, we're good.
You're good?
Okay. No, it's an easy adjustment. We raised our kids here, and although there were hardly any Jews in their high school or even regular schools, they felt very secure and comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay. So why did you undertake a study of the history of the Jews southeastern Connecticut? What impelled you to look more into that?
I don't know. I just, not only did I experience a lot of it, at least the last 40 years, but I just had an interest in the background of the area, how it developed, and the variety of this particular community. It's a very exciting place to be. And Jews have played a major
And so you,
part in it.
exactly, for 40 years, and you got to know the various towns and the way that the Jewish community has changed significantly in the various towns in that time. What have you noticed have been the biggest changes since you came to southeastern Connecticut in terms of the Jewish community?
The biggest changes, probably that the community has aged. It's diminished a little bit, but it's still very vibrant. It's We had an influx of people brought in by Pfizer Chemical. We brought in a lot of R&D people, and they really added a lot to the community. Unfortunately, Pfizer let a number of them go about 20 years after they arrived, and we felt that pinch. But the community is still very active. Although the numbers are down, we're still doing a lot of things, and it's an exciting place to be.
Okay, great. So I've noticed, I took a look at your PowerPoint and some of your photos. You go way back to the 1600s, the beginning of the country. So give us a little history about how far back we can go to find the Jewish community somewhere in the colonies, before the revolution, after the revolution. Give us a little bit of that history.
Okay, well, if you go back to 1492, the Jews were expelled. The Jews and the Muslims were expelled from Spain, but that was the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and came to the Western Hemisphere here. There's a theory that Columbus himself may have been Jewish. He had come from Genoa, and his mother's maiden name was Fortunarosa. There was a Jewish family there by that name. He sailed, of course, for Ferdinand and Isabella, who had unified Spain as a Christian country. But there were a number of what might be called conversos or Marranos, that is, Jews who converted to Christianity, or their families had, but in reality, they maintained some Jewish identity. So we know that on the ships that he sailed to the New World, that there were, for example, the ship's doctor was one of those Marranos or conversos. We know that the first person who spotted the land was one of them, and the first person who set foot on land in this area from Spain was one of them. We also know that the financing of it was not so much Ferdinand and Isabella, the crown jewels, but it was two Jews who were very active in the government, Gabriel Sanchez and Louis de Santingel. So there is a connection there. Humorously, someone once said, well, of course, he was trying to find the Orient because being a Jew, he would have wanted Chinese food. Or
the Chinese food.
Instead, he discovered
that's great. And isn't it so right? What I think it's so interesting is that as Jews who study history, we always talk about the conflict with the Muslims, but actually in Spain, before Ferdinand and Isabella came and the Catholics came along, the Jews and the Arab community did pretty well. And isn't it ironic that we're talking about
culturally and
exactly
anyways, intellectually?
Yeah. And isn't it ironic that the Jews were expelled from Spain just as the Catholics, the Christians were taking it over? And perhaps, as you said, they were the Marranos, or the Jews in secret, who were very much a part of the expedition, the financing of it, and stepping onto the New World. I think that's terrific. That's so interesting.
Yeah, about 2/3 of the Jews were given the option. They had a 3-month period on whether to stay in Spain or leave, and 2/3 of them left. A number of them went to the New World, eventually went to the New World. Others were welcomed by the Ottoman Empire. Some went to Amsterdam, actually to Holland, which was a very welcoming community for them.
Okay, so what's the next step? So now we've got, so let's talk about the colonial era. What do we have for the Jewish community there?
The first wave of Jews into what is now the United States, I suppose it's the Sephardic Jews, the Jews of Spanish or Iberian background. In 1654, that was the year that Jews who had been living in what was then Dutch Brazil, it was taken back by the Portuguese, and the Jews had to flee. Most of them went to Amsterdam. One ship, though, ended up in New Amsterdam, what we now know as New York City. And Peter Stuyvesant was very reluctant to accept them, but the Dutch West India Company, which is financing that New Amsterdam colony or community, included several Jewish people. And they convinced him that they should accept the Jews. So those 23 Jews were the beginning of the Jewish community in what is now the United States.
And as the colonial groups organized and the various states organized and had their governments, was there religious freedom for the Jews who eventually
Yes,
came over,
yeah.
or was there
As
persecution?
you know, the First Amendment includes freedom of religion. And in fact, George Washington visited the synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, and he sent them a letter saying that this government will give to persecution no assistance. Let's see, to bigotry no assistance, and to persecution no assistance. I don't know. It's at the tip of my tongue, but it's not coming out. There wouldn't be any persecution or bigotry in this country. However, it should be noted that slavery was acceptable until the Civil War. So that's a shame that blacks were not included. But Jews did have full freedom. Well, I shouldn't say full freedom. They were given freedom of religion. However, each state took their time in implementing that. For example, in the state of Connecticut, the Congregational Church had been the primary church in the state, and then they opened it up to other Christian denominations. But it wasn't until 1843 when Jews were allowed to have synagogues, and the first synagogues existed, for example, in Hartford and in New Haven.
Interesting. Well, we know about the amendments in the Constitution. That was in 1787 when that was done, 89. But what I was asking about in colonial times, as the Jews kind of came into, as you said, New Amsterdam and perhaps other areas of the colonies, was there any discrimination during that time before the United States government was created?
Well, if you go back to that New Amsterdam time, the Jews were restricted in what they could do or not do, and there were special taxes that they had to pay. But they fought for their freedoms, and they won them gradually, bit by bit.
Okay. Did you study about any other colonies where Jews came to reside before the Revolution?
There were only a handful of people. It was not significant numbers. I think by the time of the Revolution, there were about 3,000 Jews living in the United States. Most of them, by the way, backed the effort to break away from England, but there were some who were even supportive of that.
Interesting. Okay. And were they mostly of the merchant class, the business class, the Jewish families that were here?
Well, the Sephardic Jews that came, they came to be known as the grandees. They were some of them came with a little bit of money and merchandising, mercantile skills, and many were very successful. It was the later Jews that came with less money and had to work their way up slowly but surely.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Jews and slavery, because we know that in the South there were Jewish families that had slaves in their households. Did you come across any Jews who owned plantations, or were they mostly on the business end of the Cotton Empire? But they did have slaves. Talk about that.
Well, it's an interesting topic. If you go to the north and you go back to that period of Newport, Rhode Island, which I mentioned earlier, there were actually several Jewish families that were involved in the sort of shipping of what they call the triangular, actually quadrilateral system, where you would have slaves would be brought over from Africa to the Caribbean. They would make sugar cane that would be brought up to the Massachusetts area, where they would make rum and liquor, and then they would sell that in Europe, and then they would be going back. So there were a couple of them, just a handful of them. but they owned some of those ships. The majority of Jews were abolitionists in the certainly in later periods of time. So going back to the Jews owned plantations, the answer was no, but several of them did have some slaves in the South. And at the time of the Civil War, there were, I think, I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, but there were some Jews in the South who fought for the Confederacy. In fact, Judah P. Benjamin was the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. But the majority of Jews were living in the North at that time, and they were very much opposed to slavery.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, Judah P. Benjamin, I think he started out as a senator, and then he took sides with the Confederacy and became, as you said, a secretary in the Confederacy. But you're right. I think in my reading, majority of Jews up in the North were, if not outright abolitionists, they were not in favor of slavery.
True.
Right? Yeah. So now let's go forward. After the Civil War, Reconstruction, let's go to the Northeast now. Go to our area. Go to Southeastern Connecticut. When are your first look at the Jewish communities moving there?
There was a wave of what might be called Central European or German Jews who left persecution in Central Europe from 1840 to 1880. There were a number of them that came. The typical pattern was they would be peddlers for a while. Maybe they would open up a store on Main Street, and if they were really successful, they might even have a chain of stores. There were some German Jews that arrived in the New London area in about the 1860s and 1870s. In fact, they formed a congregation here. They even have a section of the cemetery in Cedar Grove Cemetery in London. They were not particularly religious, or they might have been Reform Jews. I assume that the congregation was in practice, but that community seemed to sort of fade out after a while. It was the Eastern European Jews who fled the pogroms that began in the 1880s that started arriving, and they formed the synagogue, the Orthodox synagogue that we know as Ahavat Chesed in New London. And they were mostly from Lithuania. It was interesting that there was another group that came shortly after them that came from the Ukraine and some from Poland. And they formed another Orthodox synagogue. You know the old joke about the Jew who was stranded on an island in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
He's found 10 years later, and they said, "This is curious. You were the only person on the island, but you built 2 synagogues." He said, "Well, that's the one I belong to, and that's the one I never set foot in."
Right.
So even though Jews are like one extended family, I suppose like any family, there's an occasional dissension amongst us. I found it amusing that in Kabul, Afghanistan, which at one time had a thriving synagogue, but in our day, or most recently, only had 2 surviving Jews. They would go to the synagogue, but they weren't on speaking terms. So one would pray on one side of the room and the other one would pray on the other side of the room.
Well, wasn't there also what we call the Landsman factor? In other words, Landsman meaning land, that you came from the same country or the same village. And when you got to America, your social network consisted of people from the old country who were here already, who brought you into their synagogues, into their social organizations, into their cemetery organizations, right?
Right.
Wasn't that part of it too, that they might feel more comfortable with people from their old communities back in Europe,
Probably,
in Eastern Europe?
That was true. Yes.
Yeah. So was the synagogue in New London, the Ahavat Chesed, was that the first one that you can find in southeastern Connecticut?
Well, there was this one that these German Jews had established in the 1870s, and it seems to have petered out by the 1880s. It might have been only to to have a cemetery and to have cemetery plots, and also to take care of one another as needed. The third synagogue in the New London area would be Bethel, which is the conservative congregation that began around 1930. And that was a group of Jews who, some of whom were second generation Americans, and they wanted mixed seating and certain liberal practices. They had been several locations, but they went from Blackhall Street to Ocean Avenue, and they became the dominant synagogue in the New London area for many years. But sadly, their numbers have diminished. And currently, it looks like they're going to be joining or sharing the building with Temple Emmanuel in Waterford, which is the Reform congregation that didn't even start till 1960, and has grown and now has about maybe 200 plus households, and is probably the largest of the congregations in this area.
Right. So when the German, and that's pretty much the pattern in New York or the rest of the country, that the German Jews came first in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. And what were their means of livelihood? What did the Jewish community do in the New London area when they first arrived in the 1800s?
Okay, well, they were mostly merchants who had little small stores. And Main Street at one time, if you went back to, let's say, the early 20th century, you would find a number of Jewish stores, be it the jewelry store, the clothing store, grocery store, or sometimes the liquor store would be owned by Jews. What's interesting, at least in southeastern Connecticut and eastern Connecticut, is that we have some Jewish farmers. There's the community in Chesterfield and also in Colchester, near where you are. I had a number of Jewish farms that were set up for Eastern European Jews who had come to this country, went to New York City, weren't happy with the overcrowdedness, poverty, and so they got some assistance from the Baron de Hirsch organization, a philanthropy that helped establish them as farmers in Eastern Connecticut, in Colchester and Ellington, and also in Chesterfield, part of Montville. Those communities had a challenge because the Maurice de Hirsch Fund was able to buy up these farms and give them or loan them to these Jewish families. But these Jewish families were not farmers by nature, so it was a challenge. And the other challenge was the reason why those farms were so cheap for them to buy up was because the farmers here found it very difficult because of all the rocks. In fact, Jerry Fisher, the former director of our Jewish Federation, did a film called Harvesting Stones. And so a lot of those farmers were moving to better pastures, be it in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Indiana. And so these Jewish farmers would try to make a living growing vegetables and fruit and so on. And that didn't work out for many of them. In fact, they converted it to farms where they either became dairy farms or they became chicken farms, basically producing eggs. And that was a little bit more successful. In fact, even today, there's a few Jewish farmers remaining here. But there was a synagogue that was formed in Chesterfield, very much like the one that you have in Colchester, that the founders of those two congregations were people who were the farmers. And the farmers, in order to make a living, would sometimes even open up their farms in the summertime to tourists who would be trying to flee the heat of New York City and would come there and be boarders and enjoy the country air.
Right. Yeah. Well, a couple of comments along those lines, Aaron. Speaking from Colchester viewpoint, When I moved there in 1970, there were a number of dairy farms still there, many of them run by generations who came through the Baron de Hirsch, but others from Holocaust survivors. We had several of those in Colchester and other areas of Eastern Connecticut. And you went to the egg farm. It was, that's where you got your eggs. And then the next generation of their children may stay, if they stayed in Eastern Connecticut, they may have become the doctors, the attorneys, the dentists, the rabbis, or they may have gone off to the big city, to New York or Boston. Do you see that pattern in the New London, Norwich area as well?
Definitely. You had, as I said, there were as many as like 500 people in just that Chesterfield congregation, somewhere around 1925. But today, there's hardly any left. So they went to New London, they went to New Haven, they went to Hartford, they went to New York City. And many of them were very successful. Mo Savin, for example, came from that Chesterfield. He became the mayor of New London. His brother became very successful in construction and helped build the Gold Star Bridge. So these families did okay, but they moved on. Even, I think the diminishing population today is that even though our kids enjoyed growing up in Eastern Connecticut and really flourished here, they went on to college and when they were looking for professions and careers, they found more opportunities in the big cities. So we've had people who've gone to
Exactly.
Boston, New York City, and elsewhere.
I was going to ask you that question. I know you have children. I was going to ask you, are your children back here contributing in southeastern Connecticut? I don't think so. My
No, but
children,
I have two in New
yeah,
York City, and then I have one who's in West
right.
Connecticut. He happens to be a rabbi in New
And mine are in, right, mine are in Boston. I'm just saying that our children chose not to come back to work their careers or have their lives fulfilled in this area. They left. They went to the big city. And that's the story of the Jewish community in Eastern Connecticut. It has diminished considerably since I arrived in 1970, and you arrived also 1980, about 40 years ago. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. So let's go into the early 20th century, because you've explained the Baron de Hirsch Fund, the people coming from the huge influx of immigrants from Eastern Connecticut, and those coming from Ellis Island, Lower East Side, and then coming up to Eastern Connecticut. Talk about the anti-Semitism, especially in the 1920s in America. It was virulent. It was the Proto Zion were very famous. Henry Ford had a newspaper out of Dearborn, Michigan, which was tremendously anti-Semitic and powerful. Did you see any effect of all of that on the Jewish community in Eastern Connecticut?
Well, I'm told that the KKK even had marches in this area in the 1920s. Thankfully, they hardly exist at all, if at all, today. Although there are white supremacists out there. I think it was in Scotland, Connecticut. There were some about 30 years ago that were having some gatherings. I understand that in the late 1930s, there were some Jewish cemeteries that were desecrated and swastikas were painted on them. But that's rare in our day. We did have one swastika painted on Temple Emmanuel somewhere around I'm guessing around 1990. And I know at Waterford High School, there was one incident where there's some swastikas painted on there. They never did find who did it. I know that the school had a rally. In fact, one of my sons was the guest speaker, one of the speakers at it. And it was very clear that the community at large detests that kind of behavior. And the Jews feel very comfortable here in southeastern Connecticut.
Okay.
And we flourished.
And
we have become leaders in the community. If you look at whatever category, whether it's lawyers, judges, doctors, chief of staff of L&M Hospital at one time. And culturally, we've been like the Guard Theater is run by Steve Siegel. We've had the symphony has had a number of Jews involved with it. We have done well. Academically, the Jews have been superintendents of schools, principals of schools, teachers, of course. The universities, whether it's Connecticut College or Mitchell College, we've had Jews in very key positions. Jews have even been involved with the military installation, as you may know. We have the sub base here in Groton and the nuclear subs. The father of nuclear submarines was Admiral Ribikoff. Not Ribikoff. Why am I blanking on this? Rickover, Admiral Rickover. But speaking of Ribikoff, I'm glad I said that. Jews have been leaders in the state as well as in Abraham Ribikoff did have a house in New London, but as you may know, he was the governor of Connecticut. He was a senator from Connecticut. He even served in the cabinet for John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the early 60s. Today, we have Senator Blumenthal. We had Senator Lieberman, who ran as vice president in the year 2000. And as you may know, Al Gore and Lieberman had more votes than George Bush, but because of the way our electoral college works, they didn't get elected.
Right.
We've had Jewish mayors of various cities and Jews very active in all the civic organizations, be it Rotary or Lions Club, Kiwanis, Elks Club.
Right. So I have two questions of that. One is the extent that if you did any studying about Jews participating in World War I and in World War II. What about that?
Well, the answer is yes. Jews have been very civic-minded and have answered the call of duty at wartime. I know my father served in the Marines in World War II. My mother had an uncle who died in World War I serving in Europe, in the European theater. So Jews did play an active part in the military. In those wars. Not as much in the Vietnam War, although I have a number of friends who did serve in that war. But like myself, they were probably college students at the time. Many Jews were college students at the time, and we couldn't see that as being a valid effort, and even participated in the protests against the war. Jews, by the way, were very active in the civil rights movement, nationally and statewide as well.
Right. So we're going to try to show some of the slides that you have as part of your PowerPoint program. But before we do that, I have one last area to mention, and that is the relationship of the Jewish community in Eastern Connecticut to Israel, to the founding of Israel, to Zionism. Yes. And to the relationship with Israel today. Can you just speak about that for a bit?
Sure. Well, let's go back to Hadassah began, I believe it was in 1912, and New London and Norwich were amongst the first chapters and very active chapters.
And Colchester. And
Colchester too,
I have to mention. Okay.
Morris Malov, who had a very successful jewelry store that still exists. It's run by his grandson right now, Jimmy Malov. It's now in Waterford. He was a Zionist, a very ardent Zionist, and raised money and bought land and arranged for military surplus equipment from the sub base to be sent to the fledgling state of Israel back in 1948. The Jewish Community Council started in the 1970s to coordinate the effort of raising funds for the new state of Israel. That evolved into what is now known as the Jewish Federation. And the Jewish Federation is the umbrella organization of Jews of Eastern Connecticut. It not only raises money for Israel and has a good relationship with a partnership with Israel, but does a number of things in the community as well. Taking care of kids from the youngest ages, having the PJ library for them, free books, Jewish books for them, to helping bring in these teenage Israeli emissaries who help out with our religious schools, the Solomon Schechter Academy, the youth groups. They also run a number of programs, educational and cultural, and do programs for the Holocaust Memorial Day, for the Israel Independence Day. And they have a very active senior program, luncheons with speakers and activities. And they brought in, this is one of the key things that the Jewish Federation has done. They brought in 300 Jews from the former Soviet Union to settle here in Eastern Connecticut, some of whom went on to other places, but many of them were welcomed here in this community, including my own cousins, who my family assisted in helping bring them over. And they live in New London, and their daughter lives in Branford. It was a very exciting time in the early 1990s when we brought in them and integrated them in the community, and they went on to be very successful.
That was a terrific thing. So the Federation is a very important connecting tissue, connecting all the various elements of the Jewish community in Eastern Connecticut, and they contribute a lot.
Does charitable work to the community at large. They have a very active food pantry program where they provide air conditioners to poor people in the summer and heating assistance in the winter, I think, and just a number of activities that they've done that we're very proud of.
Okay, great. Well, this has been great. Is there anything in the history that we've kind of had a little bit of an overview from you? Is there anything extra you want to add before we try and take a look at some of your slides? Anything else?
And I want to credit my wife, Karen Rosenberg, who you saw in the background there briefly earlier. She was the former principal or head of school of Solomon Schechter Academy, especially in its heyday when they had over 90 students. She took these pictures with me, but she was the photographer.
All right. Well, we're gonna see if we can show them. So we're gonna go up to the southeastern Connecticut and see if I can open them up with the PowerPoint. Can you see this on your screen?
Yeah, you see there's a little Jewish star there with southeastern Connecticut. We are the sort of one of the quiet corners of the state, and yet we've done quite a bit. This is what's
All
left.
right.
What you're looking at here is this was made into a national shrine, but it's all that's left of that Jewish synagogue and Jewish community that existed in the Chesterfield area of Montville is this foundation of what was once the synagogue.
Right. Let's take the next one. That's the Havith Chesed in New London.
Right. It's not only it's the only Orthodox. Well, it's an Orthodox synagogue here in New London, but it also has, as the Rabbi Sternberg, Avraham Sternberg, is associated with Chabad, which is the Lubavitch Hasidic outreach to the Jewish community, and they do a lot of programming as well, including his wife Mary Ashi. In fact, their son-in-law has now come to this area and is trying to do some Jewish outreach in the Norwich area as well. Okay, this is the Ohev Shalom Cemetery on Boston Post Road in Waterford. They also have a section for Ahavat Chesed there. It's the Orthodox cemetery. It's been there for well over 100 years.
Okay. And this is the Temple Israel.
Yeah, this is the Jews who lived in New London for years lived in what might be called the South End or the Fifth Ward of New London. Lovely homes, and it's near Ocean Beach. And in the summertime, they had this separate little congregation. It still exists only for the summertime. And it also was augmented by people who had summer homes that came down from Springfield, Massachusetts, or from Hartford, Connecticut. Rabbi Isidore Greengrass
Yeah.
was the rabbi of it. He lived across the street from it. He's a Holocaust survivor who really added a lot to our community, and we miss him very much since he passed away. This is the former Bethel building designed by Percival Goodman, who was one of the leading creative architects of his day. Bethel at one time had 400 families, and this is on Ocean Avenue. Next picture. That's Temple Emmanuel. It's interesting. We had been using the former Bishop Seabury Church in Groton, which is now the Islamic Center. You can see it there in that little slide. And in 1979, we built this building up here in Waterford. When we first bought land in Waterford, because it was centrally located for the county for Jews to go to, and it's just off I-95, a lot of people complained, saying, you spent $30,000 to get 20 acres in the middle of nowhere. But the truth is we sold some of the land for $450,000, and that enabled us to build the building that we really wanted. This was the original site right there underneath the obelisk for Fort Griswold. Now we're moving on to Norwich. This is Brothers of Joseph Synagogue. It was started in the congregation was started in 1900, and it was named Brothers of Joseph. You'd say, well, didn't Joseph's brothers really throw him in a pit and at one point contemplate even killing him? Well, it's not named for that Joseph in the Bible. It's when they started the congregation, to raise money, the highest bidder got to choose the name. And there was a family that had a son just born in the year 1900. His name was Joseph Lang. He lived to be 100. He died in the year 2000. But this is the Orthodox Synagogue in Norwich. It's on Broad and Washington Street. This is Beth Jacob congregation, started in 1929, but they relocated from what was Church Street in Norwich to the New London Turnpike. They have a gorgeous building and a beautiful sanctuary. It's a conservative congregation. Rabbi Julius Rabinowitz is the current rabbi there today. Okay, we're moving on to your Colchester. And this is the building that was built in 1960, the new building, but there had been previous buildings used by this congregation. Maybe you could.
Well, let me say that when we moved to Colchester in 1970, there were two synagogues, an Orthodox and the Havath Achim conservative. They eventually merged. And one other point I wanted to make, you talked about people coming to Eastern Connecticut to stay in a bungalow or stay for a week. Colchester became somewhat of a mini Catskills. We had a series of hotels. My street that I live on, Jaffe Terrace, was a hotel. There was Levy's. There were other hotels where people came from New York, from Hartford for the summer. So Colchester had that reputation with its egg farms, with the Baron de Hirsch families, with the Holocaust era families, and it became a very big summer place. Lebanon too, Grand Lake Lodge became a very important catering place and hall for many Jewish functions because it was kosher and it had the accommodation. It was where we had all our big meetings. So I wanted to put in a plug for the history of Colchester in that way.
Do you know what killed the Jewish resorts and little boarding houses there for the summertime?
What?
Air conditioning. Once New York City had air conditioning, the people didn't have to leave for the summertime.
Oh, what a good point. Okay. Couple more slides. You
Okay,
spoke about the importance of the federation.
it's really the central roof all these wonderful activities that I earlier mentioned. Um, of that couple that you see there, that's Jerry Fisher on the left. He was the director from about 1985 until a couple of years ago when Karen Savell took over. And there's so much that that organization does for our community. For example, we have a Jewish film festival. We bring in speakers all the time, and they support the synagogues with youth programming, senior programming, and so on.
Great. Okay. And the last slide I want to show is the one that relates to what you were talking about, Israel and the relationship between the Jewish community and Israel. And this is,
Well, actually, what you're looking at here is the Zach's Hillel House at Connecticut College. We knew that about 15 or 20% of the students at Connecticut College were Jewish, and we've had a number of Jewish professors there over the years, including a professor of Judaica. But we were always lacking the funds to actually make it happen, where we had a Hillel House where the Jewish students could gather on a regular basis, until Henry Zachs, a philanthropist from Hartford, began putting up Hillel houses at a variety of campuses like the University of Connecticut and Storrs and at Wesleyan. And we finally, someone who knew that family said, have you considered doing that for New London? And we do have that at Connecticut College today, and we're very grateful for that.
okay. That is, we're going to go back to our talk. That was the last slide. And I know you have some more. You go into the old pictures of the buildings that relate to the Jewish merchants. And we already talked about the Jews in politics and in other professions. So I want to end with two issues. One is the relationship between the Jewish community and the general community, the interfaith relationships and how strong they have been. And then my final question is going to be what you have in your PowerPoint, the future of the Jewish community in Eastern Connecticut. Talk about that.
Okay. First of all, let's see. The future was, okay, backing it up was, I'm sorry, what was the previous question before the future?
About your relationships in the general community. Yeah.
It's very good. It's extremely strong. We've had, for example, the rabbis have been very active in the clergy associations. We've been presidents of it and hosting events, and we have benefited also from our friendships. Temple Emmanuel, for example, before we had our first building, we spent 8 years at the Unitarian Universalist Church, All Souls, in New London. When we were rebuilding our building, we went to a Crossroad Presbyterian Church, which also opened their doors to Bethel congregation in this interim period. We've had, as I said, any incidents of anti-Semitism were overwhelmingly rebutted by our Christian friends who participated with us in various rallies, such as what happened when there was that disaster at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and 500 people gathered at Temple Emmanuel from the community at large, and a lot of our Christian clergy friends were there supporting us. So that we're very grateful for, and we see that continuing, and this is a community where Jews are very much welcome. Now, as for the future, and that's the unknown, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of our kids have grown up and moved away to opportunities in bigger cities. And we don't begrudge them for that. I mean, they have to go where they can find the kind of work that they really want to do in their life. we know that for those who remain here, we're still going to have a very vibrant community. It's going to be a little bit different. We're going to have to, the synagogues will work together. The Jewish Federation will be very actively involved with all of that. Are we going to grow? It's hard to say. There are Jews who do move here. This is a wonderful place to live, as you know. We have proximity to the beach. We have just being a little bit more in the country. It's gorgeous country. It's a great place to live. So the numbers, what will it be in 50 years or even 20 years? It's hard to say. Where there is some conversation going on among some of the Jewish leaders in our area today about possibly creating a campus where the various congregations will and the Federation will share some property and do more joint activities. That very likely will happen. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Okay, Rabbi, this was great. I had a wonderful time listening to your history. And we showed some of the important slides that Karen, give her credit, that Karen took. That was great. I want to end by getting some words from you about some words of comfort, some words of hope, because we're in the middle of a crisis. I'm doing these shows live streaming because I can't go into the studio where we would have better accommodations and better quality. We're working hard to improve all of that. We want to share our thoughts, our compassion, our love for the people who are suffering in this crisis and in a Jewish community and in everyone in the community. So Rabbi, why don't you end by giving us a few words from you on that? And thank you so much. We'll sign off after that.
Okay. The coronavirus was unexpected. 6 months ago, we never could have conceived of this, especially the way this plague has hit New York City, greater New York City area. We really feel for all of the people who are there. As I said, I have 2 sons and their families who live in New York City, and they have found ways of getting out of the city for extended periods of time. And now they're back in the city and trying to make the most of it. We all are trying to adjust to this period. Zoom and these other online formats have really saved us in many ways. The synagogues, as well as churches for that matter, have been doing their services on Zoom. And I'll tell you, I have checked out a number of them, including my son who's a rabbi in New Milford. I'm a regular on his services on Shabbat morning. Congregations have been hosting adult education and just a check-in time for people. We've managed to find ways of surviving during this period of time. And in some ways, we're staying very close-knit and tight, regardless of the self-distancing that we have to do. This too will pass. We will return to normal or the new normal. And we'll look back on this period and say that we were resilient, and we're very grateful to the doctors, to the nurses, to the emergency people, to the people who are keeping the grocery stores open and the pharmacies, and to the teachers who've been zooming their lessons one of my sons is a teacher, and he's online every day with his students, and they're trying to keep that going. So, as I said, too will pass. And when we come out on the other end of it, we'll hopefully be stronger for it, and we'll find ways of preventing this kind of thing from happening again. And if at all possible. And if not, we'll know that we have the strength and the ability to survive it and carry on. And to those families that did lose people, our hearts go out to them. especially to the seniors who are living in nursing homes and places like that. I have my 97-year-old mother lives in a Jewish home in nursing home in Chicago, and I check in daily, and they send us reports once a week on which staff members have tested positive and which residents have, or how many residents have, and they're quarantining people in their rooms. My mother hasn't been out of her apartment in 2 months. So it's tough. It's been a challenge, and we will survive.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Appreciate it very much. Please, everyone, tune in tomorrow live on Facebook, Channel 14 Norwich. We will have Congressman Joe Courtney, and I'm sure he's going to answer a lot of questions about what's happening nationally and on the state level with the current crisis. So everyone, take care. See you tomorrow. Good night. Bye.